So, as most of you know, Erik Wilde has been shaping the API world for decades through standards, books, research, and extensive work with organizations driving digital transformation. Today, Erik tackles an urgent reality. Most APIs are not ready for AI agent. He will guide us through what it means to make an API AI-friendly across its entire lifecycle. So let's go. Please welcome Erik Wilde.
Thanks. Thanks for the friendly introduction. And so let's get started. I want to talk about not just about individual APIs, but actually mostly my interest is not so much in just individual things, but also in very large landscapes, as you will see. So not so much just how do I get to build a AI app, but more how do I actually get to a place where I can do this at scale. Okay, very briefly about myself. So my name is Erik Wilde. I work at Gentic, which is a startup, and we are building the bridge between API land and AI land. That's what we're saying. What I will present today is not a product presentation, but it's definitely something that has been inspired by what I spend my time with these days, which is to think about how can organizations in a scalable way get to the place where they can start building AI things at scale. So that's how I spend most of my time. My title is Head of Enterprise Strategy, which I think is a very nice title, but we get to make up our own titles because we're a startup, so we can do that. And I also spend some time with the Open API Initiative, so I've been working with standards my whole life. And the Open API Initiative is, unsurprisingly, the place that created the Open API specification. We also have some other specifications right now, and because using standards is probably a useful thing, and for good standards to be there, somebody needs to take care of them. I think it's a good thing to try to help with the success of standards, and I do that with the Open API Initiative as something that they call an ambassador, which basically means I travel a lot to conferences. I organize tracks and conferences where people just talk about how they use standards, how standards help them to do things in a better way. And we talk about how we can improve the standards. If you want to find a little bit more information about myself, you can find me mostly on LinkedIn and YouTube these days. Okay, let's get started with the topic of the talk. One of the things that I'm guessing a lot of you have seen, because that happens every couple of weeks now, is that there are some studies coming out that talk about the fact that a lot of investments in AI are not super successful. Right? Typically, the failure rates reported in these reports are pretty bad. The last ones that I spent a little bit more time with was this one report coming out of MIT that was published in July, and then that last one, the McKinsey one that was published, I think, last week or 2 weeks ago, I'm not quite sure. But it's always interesting in my mind to read through these things a little bit and try to figure out what is it that seems to cause these failure rates, right? Because everybody is super excited about AI, and all the organizations, people say, we should do something with AI. And even there is so much excitement and so much willingness that something should happen, a lot of stuff doesn't seem to go great. And you can ask yourself why that is. I have my own theories. Sometimes it's not so easy to really get to the data that underlies these studies, that you could study that a little bit more yourself. But one theory that I have, and that informs what I'm presenting today, and that also is part of the origin story of Gentic, is that it's not so much that the things that people try to do with AI are bad ideas. I mean, maybe some are, but others are not, probably, hopefully. But oftentimes they're kind of built in a bubble, right? They're built in a place where there's some kind of team that is the AI team, like you people do something with AI, right? You show us the way. And that often doesn't work so well, because then it's hard for them to get access to the right data. It's hard for them to tap into the right business processes. So it really becomes kind of this isolation thing where it's really hard to build something that has business impact when you're building that kind of a little bit shielded from the business. And that's the main motivation really behind today's talk, is to think a little bit further. What does it take to get to a place where you can build AI products, AI applications at scale and in a successful way? And my claim would be that it's more than MCP, right? Everybody is very excited about MCP. So I'm sure you've noticed, or some of you have noticed, how old is MCP now?
5 months.
1 year and 1 day. It was released yesterday, a year ago. And so it's really, really, really new, right? But people are super excited about it, understandably, because it's the first time that we can access things from within our AI models. So we can just talk to external data and capabilities from within LLMs, which is great. But it's probably not everything that we need. It's something that we need, but not everything. And the question then is, well, probably then APIs somehow play into this picture. And I did this. This is, you can actually look it up. It's on my YouTube channel. That was from May or June, earlier this year, at API Days New York. And I interviewed a whole bunch of people there and just asked them, does AI change how we have to think about APIs? Right? Which to me is an interesting question. It's like, I have spent a lot of time in the API space, so it's important to think about, does that mean I have to do things differently, or can I just move on? And the range of responses was interesting, right? So on one extreme said, no, we don't even have to care about AI. APIs are for machine consumption. AI is just machines, so we're all good. And then the other side of the spectrum was to say, well, APIs are so yesterday, we don't even need APIs anymore. MCP will do everything. Personally, I think the truth is somewhere in between. But I think it's an interesting exercise to go through and think about what would it take to roll out AI at the scale that basically we have rolled out APIs today, right? Where our entire business landscape is based on APIs, hopefully, I guess many are. And it's really, without them, nothing would work, right? And I think a similar process will happen. And just for me, because I'm interested in where people are, I just want to do a little show of hands, even though it's hard for me to see any hands with all the lights going on. But just to know a little bit where people are. So who here in this room has all, or let's say most of their APIs in their organizations described in an open standard, probably an open API? Most of you. Thank you very much. That makes me very happy. Leave your hands up, please. Okay, we'll go on. Of those, who has a central API catalog? So who pulls all of these descriptions together in some place so that they're easier to discover? Okay, not as many, okay. Who can track every API call with full observability? Okay, still a few, that's good. Who has sandbox environments so that if they build new applications, they can play around with APIs without actually having to test their applications against production data? Still some, very good. And then who here is brave enough that they have used these things with AI applications, so they basically used AI to run against their production APIs? Okay, not that many. Okay, good. So hopefully I can show you the path a little bit. That would be my goal for today. Right? So I think, and the idea of this presentation is really to give you a little bit of a step-by-step process so that I don't have to tell you have to do all of this, and then if you don't do all of this, nothing works. And the idea is to tell you this process a little bit in a way that the steps get progressively harder. But I do think that in some shape or form, at least these things are important. These things are things you have to think about. They will present these things will show up in your journey in some shape or form. And to think about a little bit earlier may be useful, not just when you hit them and then you say, oh yeah, no, I remember hearing about this a year ago, but we never did anything, right? So maybe just keep that in mind, and also when you run into any of these problems, that you think about, oh, maybe this is a problem I will run into over and over again, so maybe I should actually solve it in a way that I solve it once and not in a different way and every time over and over again. Okay, let's go through these steps. And again, the goal of this is to bridge the gap between API land and AI land, because in my understanding, when I see how people are using APIs and AI today, there is a big disconnect, right? MCP is something that people use a lot, are very excited about, but it's kind of just mostly for experimentation, I would say. I know some people would disagree, but I think there is kind of an inherent, not a scaling problem, but MCP doesn't really address scaling, the scaling of your AI landscape, so to speak. And that's fine. They never said they would do that, right? But it's important to keep in mind that this is not on MCP's to-do list, so to speak. And just hoping that having many AI applications will somehow work out is something you can do. But I think it's probably a better idea to think about what are the recurring patterns that I will probably see, that I should design for and plan for, so that over time, then you can actually use AI in a better way. And one of the things that I liked most before I joined my current company was that the underlying story to some extent is really to say, you should only use AI when you have to, right? Use AI as little as possible. Personally, I like that story a lot, because I think that there are still many problems that we can use in traditional ways. We don't need to throw AI at everything, but there are some problems where AI is really useful. So I like having this idea of saying, when I have to use AI because I have complex planning and I have these kind of really AI-friendly scenarios, then I can use it. But for using things that I can also just use through automation and traditional programming, I should probably do that, because it's cheaper, faster, more reliable. I can actually make sure it happens the same way every time and so forth. Okay, now let me walk you through those steps that I think are necessary in some shape or form. And again, we are building things that help with that, but this is not really about us building these things, right? You can do these things in any way you like, but I think everybody will have to do these in some shape or form. So the first one is really, we want to see AI having more tools at its disposal, right? Having more tools, and as you may see that I'm a cyclist. I like having bikes. And if you work with bikes, right, then, as in many other places, having more tools is better, because you can do more things, right? That helps with solving problems. And the same is true in AI land. If you are building AI applications, when they have more tools at their disposal, they can do more things, because they have access to more data, they have access to more capability, they can kick off more processes in your organization. And what we're currently doing, to some extent, is building up this inventory, right? So in some shape or form, we have these AI consumers, and then we have a very abstract layer of digital capabilities, stuff that is just there somehow in a digital form, data, operations, things you can do, and so forth. Some of them, most of them, hopefully, do have APIs. And then the question is, okay, APIs is good, but how do I actually access those from AI applications? And this is where MCP stepped in very successfully, right? Because MCP gave us this ability to do that. You can fully automatically expose APIs through MCP. You can just take an open API description, for example, and generate an MCP server from it, right? It's like you don't have to do anything. It'll just happen, right? So that's a very cheap way, let's say, to scale your tool landscape in the beginning. Because if you have many APIs, and let's say at least some of these are described in OpenAPI, you can just press a button basically and you have a whole bunch of MCP servers available to you. And that's fine. But it's very interesting to me, again, MCP just is 1 year old, right? That over the last couple, I would almost say weeks, not even months, right? You start seeing these stories where people say, hey, wait a minute, MCP is great, but if I have too many tools, it actually doesn't work so great anymore because now my LLM gets very confused when it has access to 100 tools, right? The context window gets almost exhausted or overflows, and also it's really hard to make sense out of a really large set of tools. And once again, as I said before, this is not a fault of MCP. It's just that MCP wasn't built to address that problem, right? MCP was built, maybe that sounds a little bit too minimal, but in the end, you can think of MCP being invented to give you something as simple as I want my LLM to have access to my file system, right? Which it doesn't have normally. And I can do that if I just have a little MCP server that reads files and hands it to the LLM, right? I can solve that problem. Now it does quite a bit more, but that's kind of the origin story, right? How do I even make something available to an LLM that is outside of the LLM itself? And that's an easy way how you can go about, right? You can generate MCP servers from all your APIs. Again, fully automatic, very cheap. In my mind, that's a good way to start experimenting, to start seeing what is possible, to maybe have a little proof of concept. But you will hit limits pretty quickly. Because if you do that more and more, and if you want your MCP applications to become more powerful and you want to give them more tools, then you run into this problem of your context being too big. Right? So the advantage of this approach is that it's very easy to do. All of the machinery there is fully automated. Emmanuel Paraskakis has really nice workshops where he does, I think it takes half an hour for people to just sit there and start from their own APIs and get to a point where they can work with their own APIs in an LLM, right? Because there are tools, online tools for all of this. It's very, most of the time, I guess you actually spend out figuring authentication, right? That's the hardest bit. All the rest is kind of almost fully automated these days. You just have to string together a couple of tools and then it's kind of amazing, right? How quickly you can start just typing human language to work with your own APIs. So that's great. But it does have these disadvantages of not scaling very well once you want to do that in a little bit larger context. So in my mind, keep experimenting with MCP, that's good. But don't see that as the end game of that's all we need, right? Like once we have MCP under control, everything is great, right? So MCP in my mind doesn't really solve everything. It means that even if you have single APIs, I have one, I'll show you that one a little bit later, right? I have one API, the GitHub API. Anybody here has worked with the GitHub API? You have, how many operations does it have? Do you remember? Many. It's huge, right? It has, I think, 1,100. I have the exact number up, right? It has 1,100 like 700 endpoints, 1,100 operations. Because GitHub is complex, right? GitHub is a big thing, and if you have an API that allows you to do things on GitHub, that necessarily is a big API. But that already means that, well, if you would now just take this GitHub API and map it into MCP, you would end up with 1,100 tools. Right? And that's way too much for an LLM to make sense of. So even individual APIs can already be too big. For sure, if you get into the API landscape of larger organizations where the organization has hundreds or thousands of APIs, and some of these are potentially also large, right? You end up with thousands or tens of thousands of operations, and you clearly cannot just take all of these and stuff them into an MCP server and assume anything is going to happen. That's one problem, that existing APIs will overwhelm your MCP server. The other one is that oftentimes MCP is also not really at the right level, or your APIs are not at the right level for MCP, because there are these underlying simple operations, and oftentimes that means things are way too fine-grained for LLMs to really use these things in a good way. We'll get to that a little bit later. And the last thing is that some of the APIs you have oftentimes also aren't really described in a very great way, right? So even though maybe it was good enough for your developers to make sense of these things, but if you now have to give these things to agents, we actually get to a little different situation, and we'll get to that in a minute, right? So summing it up, the first step, we could say that having more tools is not necessarily the same thing as having a better tool landscape. It can be a part of it, but it also creates some problems, right, with managing this multitude of new tools. So now we also have to think of other things, but the first thing we want to think about is how do we better describe tools? Right? So now that we have more tools available, we have to think about how do we make them usable, so that we can actually use them without running into this problem of having way too many that we cannot easily use. Some of you may have heard this term DX for developer experience, something that has been thrown around in the API community for a long time, where the idea is how easy is it for a developer to consume an API? Right? How hard is it to understand what the API does, to onboard, to actually use it in a running application? And the big point here is that developers are smart, right? They have a lot of context, they have a lot of experience. So even if you document your API not in the greatest way, they will fight their way through, right? Because they have done that many times. They understand probably a little bit what your API probably should do. So they make some assumptions, they play around with it, and at some point they figured it out, hopefully. Right? So that's something that you can make easier with better developer experience. But the interesting point is we now have a new term that has been used for probably just a couple of months now, which is AX, for agent experience. Right? So if agents want to use my API, how does that work for them? And the interesting bit here really is agents are, to some extent, much more stupid than developers. Right? They don't have that experience of having worked with APIs for a long time, like all that long history of struggling through bad documentation, making assumptions, asking my colleague where I can hope that they know how to use the API. All these things that developers will just naturally do, agents just won't, right? They don't understand what your API does, or they will just misunderstand it and misuse it. Right? So agents are a little bit more finicky in how well you have to describe your API so that it makes sense to them. Because they are more limited in their experience that they have. Maybe that will change, that we also focus more on agents. And one of the things that we are working on a little bit, and that's just my one of two ad breaks for the Open API initiative. So we just released Open API 3.2 just a couple of weeks ago, which had a couple of themes, right? And for the upcoming new version 3.3, which doesn't have a release date yet, but one of the specific goals that we have is to actually think hard about how can we make Open API more useful for AI consumers, right? So that's something that will go into the new version, upcoming version, but we don't have anything there yet. So for now, it's more the question of you having to think through how can I do that? And there have been a number of suggestions how to do that. Focus on better descriptions, put in a lot of examples, have variations of the things that you do, make sure you have meaningful error messages so that errors actually inform consumers about what went wrong in a way that works for the consumers, right? So there's a whole bunch of guidance out there that will tell you a little bit how to better describe your API for machine consumption. It's also something that we work on. So that's my one product pitch, so to speak, not really, but so we also have a framework that allows you to score APIs. We have, I think it's going to be public next week. It'll be open source in a few weeks. And we have just a multi-step rating where we look at, is the API even correctly described? Is it well described for humans? Is it well described for machines? Is it described in an actionable way for machines? Does it have the right security policies so that machines can safely consume it? And also, is it easy to discover when I have thousands or tens of thousands or APIs? Again, you don't have to use that, but just thinking through these different dimensions that probably will matter to use APIs at scale is a useful exercise to do. I'm sure there will be other frameworks that do the same thing, but having some measure of, are my APIs AI friendly? I think that will be important in the future. But even if that is the case, even if, let's assume, you work hard, you describe all your APIs in OpenAPI, you use a rating tool, and then you also get to a high score and all of your APIs are now described in a great way, that's great. So your APIs are now AI friendly, but you still have way too many. Right? That means, how do I now scale to a point where when my agent wants to do a thing, it can find out what it can use to accomplish that task? And that's the next step in my story here, which is dynamic tool discovery. So again, very much a scalability topic, right? So the idea then is to say, well, we just do whatever we do when we have large amounts of data to deal with, right? We built in some kind of search and ranking mechanism that allows us to discover things, and that will help. And one data point that I had mixed feelings about, because it was one of the ideas that we had and we have, but just on Monday, right, Anthropic kind of, I don't want to say copied, because I'm sure they didn't copy it, but they basically now do what we said we are doing, right, which I think is totally fine, because it's a very natural thing to discover, because they discovered, oh, people are using more and more tools with MCP. That doesn't seem to work very great. So now they have built the same thing that we've built, which I jokingly called in the beginning a tool. So our MCP server actually only has two tools. It has one tool to search tools, and it has a second tool to use tools. Right? And that means that an agent with a task that it has to do can now ask, I have a task that I have to do, which tools do you recommend to me? Right? And then it gets a short list of recommended tools, and compiling that short list is much easier when you have good descriptions, right? Which is why you should have good descriptions. But then you can give a short list of tools to your agent, and it can then pick the one that it wants to use. Right? So that's kind of the story, and that's exactly what Anthropic is now doing. They have what how did they call it? The advanced tool use, right? And it's the exact same pattern. So instead of exposing all of the tools directly, there is a search function in there that hopefully finds the best tool for the job. And the interesting thing, I just want to mention that briefly, but it's something that, I don't know, in the beginning I didn't really think about that, but I think it's a really interesting distinction. When you think of the regular use of APIs, right, it's developers discovering the APIs and then using them to write an application, right? So this is a design time exercise. I plan to have an application. I need to have access to certain capabilities, so I find the APIs, and then I implement the application. and then people can use it, and it hopefully works, right? That's a design time exercise. So the thing that I need to do is find the right APIs that I need to implement my application. Agents work very differently, right? They are not, there's no design time thing. They do everything at runtime, right? So you give them a task, and then they make a plan how to accomplish that task. And as part of that plan, they figure out, oh, I probably need some information. I probably need to kick off some processes. So how can I do that, right? And they do that over and over again. So that's always at runtime, right? Every time you give them a new problem or a new task, they will do that again. So it's a very different pattern of API consumption. It's not as much design time, it's much more runtime. And that also means that the search pattern becomes much more useful, because that kind of automatically means that if you have better tools available, they will just pop up, right? You don't even need to kind of redeploy or redesign the application, because the agent will just get better tools at its disposal and will just use those. So that's kind of convenient, like a convenient side effect there, I would say. I happen to live in Switzerland, so I'm required by law to use some example like this. This thing actually exists, okay? It's not ChatGPT. I have to prove that to you. So you can go there, and no, it's not cheap, but you can actually buy that. And what I mean by this picture is that oftentimes, even if we have a scalable way to solve problems, maybe the tools that I have at my disposal are not the best tools. Maybe I have just too many tools. That can happen if my tools are too low level. I just mentioned this example of GitHub, right? GitHub has 1,100 operations or something. I have some slide with GitHub on it. Oh yeah, it's here, right. So I have the numbers here. So the GitHub API at its current form is 11 megabytes of JSON with 320,000 lines. It has 738 URI paths with 1,100 operations and 260 webhooks. Right? So it's a big API. What's interesting to me is GitHub just, I think last week or 2 weeks ago, pretty recently, released its MCP server. So GitHub now has an official MCP server. And it has way fewer tools, right? Because the tools are not at the same abstraction level than you would typically have an API, right? So for your typical GitOps flows, if you would say, okay, this is how I deal with PRs, you would actually have to combine a whole bunch of endpoints, right? And go through all the different steps. You can turn all of that into a workflow and say, well, this is how we do it, right? And expose that as a tool. So that's actually something that also for an agent becomes much more useful, because it kind of gets away a little bit from this confusing situation of, okay, I have a lot of tools, but actually I would rather have fewer and have one that is exactly purpose-made for the problem that I have ahead of, in front of me. And the very, very, very bad name that I came up with for this, I hope this will not be something that people start using, but I like the idea, is that we don't call it that way, I just like the name, is API microproducts, by saying, in the end, the fact that the GitHub API has 1,100 operations is actually not all that important. You could also say these are 1,100 different APIs, right? These are 1,100 things you can do. The fact that somebody packaged that in one API and not in 20 APIs is kind of random. That's how they did it, that's fine, right? But the important thing is really you can do 1,100 different things. And that's how I think, in the end, these things then look like for consumers, right? Because if you tell somebody, solve a problem with a GitHub API, they won't say, oh great, it's just one API to work with. They will say, oh my God, 1,100 operations. How do I find the ones that I need? Right? So you have to think through that as well. It's not that just having one API is great and everything will work. It can still be at a level that is way too granular. So the way we do search is that we kind of look at these microproducts. So we will take each operation and hand these to LLMs, but they might still get overwhelmed because there are just too many of them and it's hard to string all of these together. The way it's implemented, it's using a semantic search with a retrieval augmented generation below under the hoods. That doesn't really matter so much, but it's something where in the end we just want to make sure that we surface the most useful tools. But again, just having that search capability doesn't mean that you really have useful tools. You may still have tools that are way too fine-grained. And that's the last thing that I want to talk about in a little bit more detail is, which I think is something where we will head to, is that we probably will head towards more purpose-oriented APIs, like specific tasks where you have a workflow that does that thing, right? And that could be, for example, in the example of GitHub, that could be a workflow that uses 20, 30 different endpoints and get something done that you want to get done. And what you have to do is just use that one workflow, and you don't have to understand or have a detailed knowledge of how it strings together those 20, 30 things under the hood, right? So the way that then works is that we have these workflows that pull together APIs, and we can get to a better understanding of which workflows actually make sense and which ones we might want to have, because we can observe agents, right? We can see what they do, and if they do the same thing over and over again, well, then we at some point can conclude this seems to be something they do a whole lot. And then we can turn that into workflow, and that is better for the agents. It also becomes much better because now we have a guarantee that it gets executed in the same way every single time, because it's not the LLM figuring out, and then once the next model comes out, suddenly it does something different, right? If we put it into a workflow, then it gets executed in the same way because it's deterministic execution, right? And that's the part that I said in the beginning, that I think it's not interesting for LLMs to figure out how certain GitOps workflows work. They should just do that, right? And I should be able to tell them how that works. What they should work out is how they solve problem on top of that, right? So having those workflows actually make a lot of sense because they are the things that are representing certain business logic that I want to have executed in a repeatable way. And it doesn't make sense to have these things being rediscovered all the time. And the advantages we get out of that is things become much more predictable. It's much easier for us to follow these traces because it's not LLMs doing it, it's deterministic code doing it. It's much easier for us to guarantee compliance because we can say this has to happen that way and it will happen that way. We also have more business alignment because these workflows will represent things that we want to happen in a certain way. We don't have to use AI for that, right? AI, it doesn't make any sense to use LLMs and who knows how much energy to solve the same problem every single time we have it in front of us, if parts of that problem really could be solved in deterministic code, right? So that, I think, is also something that's really, really nice there. And the way how you do it, there are many different ways. Our approach is to observe agents, to see what they're doing, to surface patterns that we see occurring over and over again, and then to have an assisted process that will take these patterns and turn them into workflows. And then they become new APIs that are at a higher level, that are more business aligned, that are useful for agents, and we can kind of take all the lower level APIs out of the visibility of agents and just say, hey, all you want to know is how GitOps works. You don't want to know how GitHub works, right? That's just an implementation detail of that. And here's my second ad break of the day. The way we do it is another Open API initiative specification. It's called Orazzo. It's a workflow specification. It's basically a specification that allows you to represent workflows in a deterministic way. So you can describe a process that combines a whole bunch of APIs, and you can describe that in a way that it can be just executed. And the last thing that I wanted to talk about, but I won't because I'm a little out of time now, was One more thing that I think it's also important would be to say, hey, we also actually want to play around with things in a safe way so that there is a sandbox where I can test these things. I have environments where I can let my agents roam free without causing any harm. And I'm a little sad that I don't have time to talk about it, but I want to show you my picture that I generated that I'm really proud of. So this is our agent sandbox. This is the place where you can have APIs being mocked, and then you can have agents who just work against those mocked APIs. You can observe what they're doing. You can also maybe see that they're surfacing new workflows. And that will be something that also helps you to be able to roll out AI things faster because nothing bad can happen, right? So it's a safe area. Okay, and that's it. That's all that I wanted to talk about today. And my main goal really was to kind of look at these reports that we see more and more that talk about the fact that a lot of AI initiatives seem to have mixed results, to put it mildly. And that there may be some things we have to keep in mind that are important to roll out AI enablement in a scalable way. The steps that I presented to you were, we want to surface more tools, we want to better describe those tools, we want to be able to easily find those tools and give them to agents that need them. We also maybe want to improve those tools to a higher level, to workflows, and we also may want to provide an environment where these tools then can be safely used for experimentation. That's it. Thank you very much. Once again, you can find me on YouTube and LinkedIn. We have a little bit of time for questions and to encourage you to ask questions. We have my publisher, O'Reilly, was friendly enough to send a couple of books. So a little while ago, we wrote a book. It's called Continuous API Management. So for anybody asking questions, if it's an actual question, you get a book if you just ask it. So please raise your voice at the end a little bit so that it sounds like a question, and we can go forward with it.
I will come around.
Yeah, Lars, I think you can manage that. Thank you.
It would be great if the question is API or AI related.
Oh yeah, that's a bonus. You get 2 books if it is.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. I will ask you if you have already published examples of all these guidelines that are being presented in this talk.
Do you mean the description guidelines?
A concrete example exactly of APIs that are following these guidelines, actually.
We rated, so we have a, sorry, I'm skipping around. So we have a collection of public APIs that we use for our own testing. I think right now we have around 1,500 public APIs in there. This is one that we just rated for testing. This is one of the Twilio APIs. So this came out not great, but also not terrible. We are in the process of rating all of them and then publishing the ratings for all of them. But to be honest, we also want to make sure that our rating really works well, because it would be bad if we publish bad ratings and then later we have to say, oh, actually your API is pretty good. So yeah, please, check back with us, with me in a couple of weeks, then we have more stuff available.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks. We have one up front here.
Thank you for the good talk. My question is about the workflows, because workflows are mainly user specific. We currently have the problem that we do APIs and then do engineering customer specific, so we don't have a normal workflow for every customer.
No, not for every customer, but you will probably have workflows for certain business functions that you have. So for example, one area that we currently work with a little bit, where there are a lot of established workflows, is just basically customer relationship management, right? Where you have certain workflows where it's clear that if you engage with somebody, this is what has to happen. You have to check this, you have to check this, you have to check this, and you can do this and you can do that, right? That's kind of a workflow that you would otherwise probably document somewhere in just a standard operating procedure, right? And that probably should exist as something that an agent can do as well, because if you just give them the Word document with a standard operating procedure, they tend not to understand that as well. So I'm sure there are some workflows that would be very individual, but I think there are also a lot of areas where there are highly standardized workflows that you can probably discover and put into executable code.
Okay, thank you.
We have one more here.
More questions?
We have 5 books, just to let you know. So.
Oh, okay, thank you. So I'm in. Okay, so my question is more about security. So I wondered whether there are some, well, recommendations how to define good APIs for AI consumers, because I can imagine that we need to have additional functionality for security.
Yeah, so I mean, for now, our security, so we have a security rating in here, but it's actually more good practices around API security in general, right? Like have a security policy, don't violate the OWASP policies, these kind of things. In the consumption then, I would definitely, what I would recommend right now is to follow all these discussions of security in the MCP space, right? Because they have all these really interesting discussions on how to use delegation and downscoping and all these things that you can do and that you definitely should do, right? Like what you should not do is, for example, let an agent impersonate a user and then assume that this is going to go well. This is probably not a great idea. So it's at that point, I would say it's less the API security aspect. It's more the question, which is why we have this picture of having this security thing in here. And again, MCP does the same thing in some shape or form, but you should have some way of how you handle security specifically for AI consumers, right? Because they are actors and you should treat them as actors and not just as a kind of transparent piece of software.
So you say it's more better of the security box up there and not the API itself.
Yes, yes. So which was actually our original motivation for the sandbox, to say the sandbox also always has a security layer in there, so that any agent interacting with APIs has to go through that layer, and then we see what they do. We downscope things, we delegate things properly, and then we can be sure that we handle that in a responsible way in one place, and don't have the situation where we tell all of our developers, please don't do this, right? Because that will be terrible.
And there are great guidelines for security in agentic AI environments from the OWSAAP. Yes.
OWASP, yeah. Just say OWASP, it's easier.
So thanks.
Yeah, that's true. They just added some. So basically, they used to have guidelines. I mean, those ones down here, the API security guidelines they have, those ones have been around for ages. I think 2019 was the first one, and now they have started working on kind of the agentic guidelines as well. Yeah. Thanks.
So 2 more books to give
Two
to
more
go.
books.
2 more questions allowed. No more questions?
No more questions?
Okay, so thank you so much.